50 years ago next week, in the barren deserts of New Mexico, American scientists working on the Manhattan Project exploded the world's first atomic bomb, Trinity. What remained a secret for 50 years was that the team of scientists that developed the atomic bomb had secretly injected American civilians with plutonium to see what happened. They were not alone. Throughout the Cold War, British and American scientists carried out hundreds of radiation experiments on vulnerable people. They used cancer patients to test the effects of radiation on the human body. They injected hundreds of pregnant women with radioactive isotopes. They secretly removed the bones from dead British children to experiment on. And they gave radioactive food to British Asian women without telling them. This film tells the true story of how scientific arrogance and Cold War zeal led doctors on both sides of the Atlantic to carry out deadly experiments. Albuquerque, New Mexico. The human radiation experiments would never have come to light were it not for the persistence of a small-town reporter who stumbled across a story that would eventually earn her a Pulitzer Prize. Eileen Welsom had gone to look at some scientific papers in a military archive.
It was the spring of 1987. It was about this time of year, and they brought me out a stack of reports. And I sat there and I began to read these documents. I was just about to put them away and go home for the day when I found a footnote in the back of one of these documents. There was a reference to 18 people who had been injected with plutonium. I mean, there was something about it that I found repugnant, that human beings were injected with a material which is used to trigger atomic bombs. And I wanted to find out everything I could about the experiment, who these people were, what happened to them, how the United States government could allow something like this to happen.
The plutonium experiment was masterminded in New Mexico in the 1940s by scientists developing the atomic bomb at Los Alamos. Once a tiny village, Los Alamos is now one of the world's biggest and most secretive nuclear weapons laboratories.
I called Los Alamos and I said I would like to know more about this experiment in which 18 people were injected with plutonium. He said, "That's preposterous. Los Alamos never had anything to do with people injected with plutonium. This was in 1987. I said, "Well, sir, I'm afraid you're wrong. They did so, and the documents show that to be a fact."
Eileen Welsom set about tracing the 18 hospital patients who'd been injected with plutonium. But the trail was 40 years old, and their identities were hidden by a code. So for 2 years she crisscrossed the country trying to track them down. And then one day she found a reference hidden in a file to a patient codename CAL-3, who had lived in a small town in Texas.
Right then, a light went off in my head, and I thought, I can find somebody in Italy, Texas. That's a small enough place.
Using other clues, it took Eileen Welsom a single phone call to identify her first plutonium victim, a black man called Elmer Allen. Elmer had died the year before, but his family still lived in the town. They were regular churchgoers, but Elmer had been little more than the town drunk, a man even his family dismissed as a nobody.
So we were just totally taken aback because we all thought my father was so insignificant. We had no idea that he could have been used in experiments that was this serious, this important. It's one of the most horrendous things I've ever heard that's been done to human beings, injecting them with something as toxic as plutonium secretly, not really letting these people know.
Elmer Allen's career as a guinea pig for the American government began in 1947. He'd been working as a railway porter in San Francisco when he injured his leg in a fall from a train. He was admitted to the University Hospital for treatment, but his leg failed to heal properly, and a doctor at the hospital diagnosed cancer of the bone. And then, on July the 18th, 1947, Elmer's doctors loaded a syringe with a substance so secret it was only ever known as the product. Elmer was to be injected with what scientists thought at the time was the most toxic element known to man, plutonium.
Well, it's hazardous because it's extremely toxic. If it gets into the human system, it tends to concentrate in the bones. The lifetime tolerance that's permitted for a human being is about 0.6 of a microgram. That's 0.6 of a millionth of a gram.
The manufacture of plutonium in industrial quantities for the first time was a vital part of the Manhattan Project. But its toxicity presented a formidable problem, according to scientists who still defend the plutonium injections.
The upper levels of management were deeply concerned that some of their most important, crucial people would become overexposed with plutonium and might suffer some sort of serious health consequences. They were vital to the project, and they didn't want them put out of commission.
The scientists decided the only way to find out how plutonium behaved in the body was to experiment on humans. They chose to inject hospital patients, a decision condemned by doctors who have studied the experiments.
The researchers themselves didn't make the sacrifice. They didn't inject themselves, they didn't inject their children, they didn't inject their wives. They didn't do that. They decided to pick these unsuspecting civilian victims who were generally uneducated and minority.
4-year-old Simeon Shaw was severely ill with leukemia. He was injected with almost 3 times the supposed safe dose of plutonium. He died 8 months later. Ida Schultz Charlton had hepatitis. She got 5 times the safe dose. And Albert Stevens was injected with 90 times the tolerance dose of plutonium. But sometimes the cancers caused by plutonium can take decades to appear. And like half of the subjects, Albert survived for years afterwards.
None of these people were harmed. None of them who died 20, 25, 30 years after the event showed any signs of having been damaged in any way.
But not all the patients survived so long. Dermatitis sufferer Fred Sowers was given 6 times the safe dose. Like half of the patients, he died within 18 months.
Some of the patients might have lived on a relatively normal life. On the other hand, it might have caused early death in certain of the patients.
Manhattan Project scientist Carl Morgan is now a world authority on the dangers of radiation. He remains strongly critical of the plutonium experiment.
It was a terrible gamble with humans. It was something I'm thankful I never condoned among those scientists under my supervision.
Can we be certain that those who were injected did not go through considerably more suffering than they otherwise would have before they died?
I can't say one way or another. Who knows?
Does that not matter?
It would matter if you knew, but we don't know.
We do know what happened to Elmer Allen. He was injected with twice what was then thought to be a safe level of plutonium. 3 days later, his leg was amputated. The doctors told him he had cancer, but as it turned out, they were almost certainly wrong.
What I think happened is they may have made a mistake and thought he had cancer. Someone did. They put him in the guinea pig protocol. He got the plutonium. They realized he didn't have cancer, and they had to take his leg off. to get rid of the plutonium.
Elmer Allen never knew he'd been injected with plutonium, but he suspected something untoward had happened. For years, he told the townsfolk of Italy, Texas, that he'd been guinea-pigged in the hospital. But no one believed him, not even his family.
We always thought it was his mind. He was thought of to be rather on the crazy side. Usually his most adamant conversations about that would take place when he had been drinking rather heavily. So it all sounded like the babblings of a crazy man.
In 1977, still claiming to have been guinea-pigged, Elmer Allen was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. The man who was codenamed CAL-3 by the scientists who secretly injected him with plutonium died in 1991.
This particular experiment, I do feel now, robbed me of a relationship with my father. I'll never be able to recapture that. I'll never be able to tell him, I do now understand what you were trying to say. I do understand how you do feel. As far as I'm concerned, my father died on July 18th, 1947. The person that I lived with for 44 years after that was CAL-3, one of America's human nuclear guinea pigs.
Scientists are still split over whether the plutonium experiment was of any value at all. Its defenders maintain it was crucial to the success of the Manhattan Project.
What the data from the human plutonium study set out to do has in fact done its job. And the largest, most unknown enterprise in the history of human engineering and technology was taken with no industrial disasters.
If you look at the International Commission on Radiation Protection standard for plutonium, they specifically look at this information and they throw it away because the science was so poor. They discarded this information. They used the animal experiments, not these human experiments, to protect people. These experiments were not useful in protecting workers, nor were they useful in protecting the society in general. They were just a waste.
There still can't be any justification for injecting someone with a poisonous substance without telling them, can there?
I don't like the tenor of your questions. I'm not prepared to talk about the ethics of this matter. It's out of my realm. I'm prepared to talk about the science.
The investigation into the plutonium injections was finally published in November 1993. In the months that followed, there came reports of other equally disturbing radiation experiments, many carried out in the 1950s under the bizarre code name Project Sunshine. As part of Project Sunshine, children, hospital patients, and pregnant women were exposed to radioactive substances in secret experiments. And in 1953, Willard Libby, the head of Project Sunshine, decided to launch a project in which the corpses of civilians would be secretly experimented on by U.S. scientists, saying,
"If anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country."
But were experiments like these a purely American phenomenon? In 1955, Willard Libby announced,
"A similar study is underway in England, and we hope that the American and British studies will be fully coordinated."
The British government denied carrying out similar experiments. But here, hidden among the millions of files in the National Public Record Office at Kew, in a document originally classified secret, we found evidence that the British did indeed have their own version of Project Sunshine. As we discovered, it also involved macabre experiments on the corpses of thousands of British children. A note in the file says, "The whole matter is to be kept confidential." The British Project Sunshine was prompted by worries about the effects of atomic explosions. As the Cold War had intensified, so had the frequency of atmospheric nuclear tests. The explosions hurled vast amounts of radioactive debris high into the atmosphere, and the radiation, sometimes carried thousands of miles by the wind, began to rain back down onto the Earth as fallout. In Britain, radiation levels began to rise, and government scientists started to worry about how it was affecting the population. They decided the only way to find out was to experiment on the bones of dead children. Between 1955 and 1970, hospital pathologists removed body parts from 6,000 corpses, many of them children, and sent them to the government's nuclear laboratory at Harwell to be analysed for fallout. One of the children was a 6-month-old baby girl who lived on the Welsh island of Anglesey. Valerie Williams died suddenly in the summer of 1957.
I woke up in the morning and the baby was fighting for breath. And phoned the doctor. He came and immediately called for an ambulance. Took her to Bangor. On the journey to the hospital, she smiled at me, and that's haunted me ever since, really, you know. She smiled, you know. But within an hour or two, she was dead.
Valerie's leg bones were then removed by a hospital pathologist and sent to Harwell. To stop them seeing what had been done to the baby's body, Valerie's parents were not allowed to dress their daughter for the funeral.
I asked if I could put a christening robe on her, but I wasn't allowed to. And that upset me terribly, because she wasn't christened, you see.
Did anyone ever say anything to you about an experiment?
Definitely not. No way. Nobody asked anything.
No one asked me about doing things like that to her, taking bits and pieces from her, no. It's a terrible thing to do.
12-month-old Railton Jones also fell victim to the scientists' curiosity. His leg bones were removed after he died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage in 1957.
Did anyone ask you about any kind of experimentation?
Absolutely not. No, I remember it very clearly. It's not the kind of thing that happens every day, is it? And my memory is quite clear. The more I've thought about it, the more angry I've become, because I think it almost feels like a violation, if you like. It spoils the image of a perfect baby, and he was a perfect baby, he was beautiful. And that has damaged that. The knowledge that there were parts of him removed. Yeah, I found that very, very upsetting.
The experiments on dead children were organised by the government's Medical Research Council.
Bones were removed from corpses without the permission of the relatives. Why wasn't permission sought?
It has to be said it was not considered standard practice to obtain such permission at that time, and my understanding is that there is still a question of legal doubt as to where ownership, if one can use that word, rests of a body.
There must be a lot of people at home, sitting at home now, having had the nearest and dearest in car crashes and things, not knowing that they've had bits of them as well, you know, for all we know.
I'm sure that this is not the only thing that's been secret. I dare say there are a lot of other things that have been done in secret and that we don't know about, and I think that it needs to be exposed. I think that we need to be aware that these things can happen.
Off northwest Australia are the Montebello Islands. This was the place chosen to explode Britain's first atomic weapon.
In 1952, Britain began a series of nuclear tests.
Out at sea on board the Campania, Dr. Penny and his team made final adjustments to their instruments in the control laboratory.
One of the things the British military were most anxious to know was how the radiation produced by the atomic bomb would affect the human body. The job of supplying the information fell to the government's nuclear laboratories at Harwell. Within a year of Britain's first nuclear test, Harwell scientists were coming under pressure to carry out radiation experiments on real human beings. In 1953, proposing the use of human subjects, a top scientist at Harwell wrote, "It has become increasingly urgent to obtain more information regarding the emergency tolerance for wide areas of the body." We have evidence that British scientists could have obtained this information by experimenting on civilian hospital patients. The first clue to what happened in Britain came from an experiment on the other side of the Atlantic. In the early 1960s, cancer patients in Cincinnati were offered a special kind of radiation therapy. Mike Spinagel's wife had no idea he was about to become part of an experiment.
All they said to me was, "We've talked to your husband, and he has agreed to have this radiation treatment." Period. There was no mention of experimentation or what it was for or anything else. That's all.
Beatrice Player was also offered what her family thought was radiation therapy.
From the beginning, it was stated to my father that it's treatment anytime they talked to my mother. At no time did anyone in our family know that she was part of an experiment. Thought that she was just part of a treatment.
What none of the patients knew was that the doctor who was supposed to be treating them, Eugene Sanger, was actually performing a human radiation experiment for the American military. The Pentagon had pressured Carl Morgan to perform similar experiments, but his work on animals had convinced him it would be wrong to experiment on humans, and so he refused.
I was convinced that high-level exposure not only could cause death, but it could cause what apparently was excruciating pain to these animals, and undoubtedly would do the same to humans.
Dr. Sanger's experimental subjects were isolated in specially built chambers like these and exposed to intense radiation. Over a period of 11 years, 88 cancer patients were irradiated in Cincinnati. All of them died, some killed by their cancers, but many by the radiation therapy. Dr. Sanger still claims that he was trying to cure his patients. Other doctors say they were denied treatment so the scientists could observe their radiation sickness.
They had to intentionally tell the staff, don't treat these like real patients. Just let them be sick and vomit. Until the patients really begged for treatment on their own, they were denied treatment for nausea and vomiting. Secondly, the direction of the dose that was planned was from one side. Now that was not proper medical treatment, which would go all the way around the body. One side mimics military research.
The effects of the radiation on Mike Spinagel were dramatic.
I hadn't the faintest idea that death was that close to him. And it was only after he had the whole body radiation that he just went downhill. Well, within a month he was dead.
The radiation had equally dramatic effects on Beatrice Player.
She died in May, so within a month she went from 110 pounds to 67 pounds. It's real upsetting, but it's more upsetting to find out after 30 years that she was part of the experiment.
Despite repeated requests, Dr. Eugene Sanger refused to be interviewed for this film.
If I had one thing to say to him, I would say, let me try that on you and see how would you feel. Let me try what you tried on my wife. Let me try the same whole body radiation and see how long you'll survive.
I would say, you had no right to do this. You killed my husband, and I think you ought to admit what all of you have done.
The Cincinnati experiment was carried out by American doctors for the American military. But here in Britain, doctors also carried out radiation experiments of potential interest to the military on cancer patients. This scientific paper describes how in 1956, cancer patients at Oxford's Churchill Hospital were given doses of whole-body irradiation, the same technique used in Cincinnati. Dr. Alice Stewart is an expert on the effects of radiation on the human body. She says the radiation used in the Churchill experiments could not have helped the patients.
To give a whole body dose of the order that's needed to kill the cancer automatically kills the patient. So they can't have been giving, there can't have been any therapy.
So what were they doing?
I don't know. I think that they were using their very ill patients to have a test done before and after this dose.
We managed to identify a woman who died after being treated for cancer at the Churchill the year the experiments were carried out. Georgina Goddard's son has always believed she was experimented on in the hospital.
I was living in Oxford at the time and used to go up to see her. And then one evening when I went up there, she said, I've been taken into a room entirely on my own. But she said there was a huge machine brought down over my body. She said, I felt awful being there on my own. She had no doctors, no nurses, and I had to stay there for about 20 minutes. She said it frightened me a bit, I must say.
Wilf's mother had described being given radiation. The effect on her was dramatic, as it had been on the Cincinnati patients.
Within a few days, from being a bright and breezy person as she was when she was admitted to the Churchill Hospital, she just went down. She'd no strength at all, inclined to be weeping. I was shocked, really, to think that from being my mother, she was now getting into a very, very sick person.
Wilf's mother died 12 weeks later. She had suffered the classic symptoms of radiation sickness described in the paper reporting the Churchill Hospital experiments.
If she hadn't had treatment at all, I feel certain that she would have gone on for another 2 or 3 years.
Like Dr. Sanger in Cincinnati, the Churchill Hospital scientists insist the experiments they carried out were purely medical and aimed at treating the patients. But could the Churchill experiments, like those in Cincinnati, also have a military application?
These experiments clearly would have been a military interest. The bone marrow effects of radiation are one of the things that would happen to soldiers, and these experiments were designed in part to determine what those effects were and perhaps how they could be avoided.
If it were to come to light that at that time the doctors in Oxford were simply experimenting on her, how would you feel about that?
Well, I would be shocked. Shocked indeed. As I said, if it was a treatment, an experimental treatment that may have killed her, may have improved her, if it was experimental, I think we would have said, okay, go ahead. But if it was just an experiment not allied to medical treatment, then it would have been a different kettle of fish.
With the atomic bomb, American scientists unlocked the devastating might of the atom.
But not all the human radiation experiments in Britain and America had military applications.
At the Oak Ridge National Laboratory's Medical Division, radioactive liquids are used...
Almost as soon as they became available, doctors began to use radioactive substances to learn more about the human body.
Well, here's to my health.
Even though the doses involved were low, many of these medical experiments have left a tragic legacy.
But don't worry about it.
In Nashville, Tennessee in the late 40s, scientists gave radioactive iron to 800 pregnant women whose metabolism they were studying. Now, the subjects of the experiment, who say they were never told, are suing Vanderbilt University for millions of dollars and are meeting to share their experiences.
My name is Ron Ham.
I was born February 9th, 1947 at Vanderbilt Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. I come to know at age 46 and a half that my mother had been given radioactive iron, some sort of concoction. I feel that my mother was raped. She was taken and violated, given something she did not ask for, used, abused, and if those words sound harsh, somebody will have to deal with it. We all have been violated in the worst possible way.
I went to Vanderbilt Hospital because it was recommended highly as one of the best hospitals in the country, and I tried to eat everything they said to eat. I tried to do everything they said to have a healthy child, and then they give me the radioactive iron that I know nothing of and violated my child. That wasn't a little white rat, nor was it a guinea pig that I was carrying at that time. It was a real live baby.
My mother was sick from 1945 until she died on my birthday, July 25th, 1979. I have a brother that died in 1990. He was a police officer. He died of cancer. I know they both died because of the radiation. I know that.
My mother passed away a few years ago. She talked about getting a drink, and they called it a cocktail, and they told her to take it. And she took it, of course, and they told her it was good for her baby, which was me.
Did they tell any of you other ladies that this drink was would be good for your baby? Is that what they said? Good for you and your baby. Wow, that's terrible.
Yes, it is.
But it wasn't only in America that scientists exposed unborn babies to radiation. Similar experiments were carried out in hospitals all over Britain. In Liverpool, in 1953, more than 40 unborn babies were exposed when doctors injected their mothers with radioactive sodium solutions in a study of the placenta. Some of the women subsequently had abortions. Their fetuses were finally minced to measure the radioactivity they'd absorbed. And in 1952 and 1957, at London's University College Hospital, 30 pregnant women were given radioactive iodine in studies of the thyroid gland. One of the doctors who carried out the experiments claims the doses he used were harmless.
We're all being radiated all the time, so-called background radiation from the sky, from the buildings that we're in at the moment, and from the earth underneath us. If we give less than that, it can't do much harm, and you can't prove that it does any harm.
But 2 years before Dr. Halnan's experiment, a study had shown that exposing a pregnant woman to even a single X-ray examination could increase her child's chances of developing cancer. The work was carried out by Dr. Alice Stewart.
Pregnant women should be absolutely out on any story to do with radiation. We have evidence that, for instance, the commonest cause probably of childhood cancers is natural background radiation. So if you add anything to that, you're adding to what is already a perceptible risk.
Would you say that the doses that you used in the experiment were safe?
Yes, both to the patient herself and to the baby or the fetus.
There is no dose of radiation that is safe with respect to production of cancer. There never has been any evidence that such a safe dose exists.
Former Manhattan Project scientist John Goffman is a world authority on the dangers of low-level radiation.
I worked on that question for 20 years, and in 1990 I published what I consider a definitive view, namely, with 9 separate human studies at low doses, cancer was produced.
Dr. Halnan never carried out a follow-up study of the women or children in his experiment to see if any of them developed cancer.
It didn't seem to be necessary then. And I'm not sure it really would be necessary now, because we know very well the kind of doses that cause cancer and leukemia, and they're many times higher.
The doctors at Vanderbilt claimed that the doses of radiation they gave were harmless. But a follow-up study found a 4-fold increase in cancer among the exposed children. Emma Kraft was one of the pregnant women who was given radioactive iron. In 1946, she gave birth to her daughter Carolyn. For the first 6 years of her life, Carolyn was a normal, healthy child. Then, in 1956, Emma found a growth on Carolyn's leg and took her to be examined by a specialist.
He came down and told me that it was cancer. And that just tore me up. Nobody had cancer in my family, but I'd heard what a horrible thing it was. It went up through her spine and paralyzed her. Then went to her heart, went to her lungs, and it come out in her mouth. It was horrible.
Carolyn Kraft died in 1958, aged 11.
I did nearly commit suicide. I thought about getting in my car and just driving, closing my eyes. But I had 3 more girls. I said, I can't do that.
It was not until 1993 that Emma Kraft discovered that she had been part of the Vanderbilt experiment, and that Carolyn died from a rare form of cancer which has been linked to radiation exposure.
I thought it was God's doing. I accepted her death on account of that. I thought it was God's will. And then find out 50 years later that it wasn't, that the human beings did it.
In British hospitals, between 1950 and 1960, at least 390 unborn babies were exposed to radiation in experiments similar to the one in Nashville. But nobody knows how many cancers may have resulted, because unlike in America, no follow-up studies have been carried out. And one British experiment was even more disturbing than that at the Vanderbilt. In a medical experiment at Hammersmith Hospital in 1952, radioactive sodium was injected directly into the placentas of 270 women just before they gave birth, using a specially designed syringe.
I can't understand how they could begin to do it. It's my belief that the 270 offspring, I think some died, but of those that lived and had offspring, there probably is what I can only describe as an untraceable effect of this radiation. It must have had some effect.
The Medical Research Council, who conducted the experiment, say the doses were low and see no need for a study to follow up the children who were exposed to radiation.
I would doubt whether this would yield anything of any great value, and again I think there would almost certainly be 42 years on very considerable practical problems in identifying precisely which individuals were involved.
Do you not think it's an important question, though?
I think it's important. I mean, at one level it might be regarded as an important question, but I candidly would suggest that we have better and more important things to be using medical research monies for now.
But this woman would disagree. In 1962, when she was pregnant with her first child, Kathleen Morrison was one of 91 women repeatedly injected with radioactive iodine in an experiment at the Medical Research Council's unit at Aberdeen Maternity Hospital. Kathleen says although they knew radiation was involved, she and the women she knew did not understand the risks.
We didn't realise how dangerous radioactive materials were. We really were pretty ignorant about it, and nobody said there was any risk involved, and we didn't really believe that doctors would ever put us in any danger, and certainly not our unborn children.
Kathleen gave birth to a healthy baby girl, but in the years that followed, she became concerned about the effect the radiation might have had on both of them.
I worried mainly about my daughter. I worried about things like leukemia and that sort of thing. And then 7 years ago, they discovered that I had cancer of the thyroid, and I had to have a partial thyroidectomy. It was a pretty shattering experience, and I must admit I feel that it might very well have had something to do with the experiments that were done.
In fact, it is known that exposure to radioactive iodine is a cause of the extremely rare form of cancer that Kathleen Morrison suffered. Kathleen's cancer is now in remission, but what angers her most is that the experiment was carried out years after it was known that the fetus was at risk from low-level radiation.
Well, I'm absolutely horrified that in 1962 they were prepared to inject myself, a pregnant woman, with radioactive iodine when they had known earlier that there was a problem. I feel that our trust was betrayed. It was bad enough putting the parents at risk, but putting the unborn children at risk was, to my mind, indefensible.
This is Windscale, where two separate atomic piles transmute enriched uranium into the raw material of the atomic bomb.
Windscale opened in 1951. Part of its job was to produce plutonium for Britain's nuclear weapons.
During World War II.
But in 1957, a fire spread radioactive iodine across the north of England. As radioactive milk was dumped, governments across the world began to wonder how they could protect their populations from accidents like the one at Windscale. Here at the Wrentham School near Boston, Massachusetts, American scientists found their own way of answering the question. To mimic the fallout produced by the accident at Windscale, they gave radioactive iodine to 70 retarded children as young as 1. But no one has ever been able to trace any of the children to find out what happened to them, because all records of the experiment have disappeared. But this was just one of many radiation experiments on institutionalized children in the state of Massachusetts. 20 miles from Wrentham, there was another home for retarded children.
Remember yelling out the windows? Yelling? No windows left. Hey, you coming to see me today or what?
In 1952, Austin LaRock and Charlie Dyer were both pupils at the Fernald State School.
We were kids, we were on that floor over there.
Both had ended up here because of family problems.
I was in, Ward 1, Ward 2,
When they were asked to join a special science club, Austin in particular was delighted.
Came here when I was 10. The first visitor I had, I was about 16 or 17 years old. So you figure all them years, nobody's ever come to visit me. So to have somebody come up and offer me an opportunity to become something worthwhile in my life, that's a wonderful feeling, believe me.
The members of the science club enjoyed special privileges over the other children.
They took us to the movies, baseball games, and then they gave us these little gifts and stuff, and like watches. Oh, I was tickled pink for the watches and all this and that. Just to get out of the building and off the grounds, it was something new to experiment or something.
As part of the science club, the children ate special breakfasts of oatmeal, milk, and pills. What they weren't told was that the milk on their cereal had been laced with radioactive calcium by scientists carrying out a nutritional experiment. Charlie didn't always want to eat his breakfasts.
Sometimes I was upset with it. When they would give me, I'd get a little hot-tempered, and they used to sit me down and, come on now, take it easy. You all right? I said, yeah, I'm all right. I don't like taking these pills and stuff you people are giving me. Well, it's almost over. It's almost over. Don't worry about it. It won't harm you.
After a few months, the science club disbanded. Austin and Charlie thought nothing more about their special breakfasts for the next 40 years. And then in 1993, the experiment at Fernald hit the Boston headlines. Charlie and Austin were horrified to discover that, as members of the science club, they'd been used as human guinea pigs.
I feel that I was betrayed because I feel that the science club was set up as a bribery towards children by offering these little things in return for what they were doing and not telling them what they were doing to them in the first place.
Felix Bronner was one of the scientists who conducted the experiment. He admits the use of radiation was deliberately concealed.
There had been nuclear bombs. People were therefore understandably and appropriately afraid of radioactivity on the one hand. At the same time, scientists were very much excited about the possibility of using radioactive traces. There was a conflict between how much do you tell and how much don't you tell, how do you put people off, don't you put people off.
Dr. Bronner claims the amount of radiation the children were given was harmless. But Charlie Dyer is worried about the effect it may have had on his children.
I had a daughter that was born with whole organs reversed on one side. They found her heart and her organs all reversed. They say it's 1 out of 1,000 born like that. And my other daughter was born with a hole in her heart and her lungs. That's my youngest one.
The fears are unjustified, but fears of having been a victim are very satisfying. And people like to be in that situation often.
I just think it's very deplorable that the American people can allow such a thing to happen in this country especially. That's what's upsetting more than anything else, that we be used in children that were supposed to be helped as guinea pigs. I just can't buy it.
In the late 1960s in the United States, a series of medical scandals resulted in a clampdown on experimentation on human beings. But on the other side of the Atlantic, the human radiation experiments continued.
Let's make the change.
Coventry, home to one of Britain's longest established Asian communities.
Let's make the change.
In 1969, Punjabi housewife Pritam Kaur, who spoke no English, went to see her GP complaining of migraines. Pritam's doctor said the headaches could be caused by anemia and told her she should eat some specially prepared chapatis.
He told her that this chapati will help you to find out what you're really lacking. He said somebody will come and see you at your house and give you this chapati, and you eat it for a few days, then we'll take you and check you out.
But the chapatis had nothing to do with improving Pritam's diet. They'd been laced with radioactive iron as part of a nutritional experiment for the Medical Research Council. Pritam and another 20 Indian women had become part of a human radiation experiment.
If we knew, like mother just told me right now, if she knew about it, she would not eat it.
Every morning, a chapati was delivered to Pritam's door, and every afternoon someone would call to see she'd eaten it. And then one day the experiment entered a new stage.
This gentleman arrived at 7, came to our house in a van. He took her, my mother, and Tanti and her girl to this Oxford place.
Pritam and another woman in the experiment were driven to what they thought at the time was a hospital near Oxford. But in fact, they were taken here, to the Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell, the heart of Britain's nuclear research program. Pritam was placed in a special machine to measure the radiation she'd absorbed from the chapatis.
As she remembered, they put them into some sort of a kind of a chamber or a box type of thing. Didn't have to even change clothes. The machine functioned like tick tick a couple of times, and that was it, and they were taken out of it. At no time they ever told them that they're taking part in some sort of a experiment. It was basically they believed all the time it's gonna help them.
I call that a plain lie. I think it's taking advantage of the situation of not being able to understand the language, making it sound much more natural than it was, and then having the added thing that, of course, it's going to improve your diet. I mean, there's a plain lie for you. That, I think, should never have been allowed.
Like many of the human radiation experiments we uncovered, the Coventry experiment was carried out by the Medical Research Council.
My understanding is that informed consent was obtained where there were language difficulties. Then informed consent was obtained in the presence of and with the assistance of a family member who was fluent in English.
Nobody at no time told them anything. What is taking place? So basically, it was they were kept in basically total darkness.
We've spoken to one lady who says that she was never told that the experiment involved radiation, and if she had known that it did, she would never have eaten the chapati. That's clearly unethical, isn't it?
Well, if that is correct, yes, that is unethical.
Yet the Medical Research Council do not intend taking any action against the scientists involved.
As long as the doses used were no greater than the standard investigative doses, then I do not see that there's any basis for any detailed investigation.
So you won't be calling for any kind of inquiry into this?
No, I will not.
In the course of the research for this film, we uncovered more than 70 British experiments in which human beings were exposed to radiation, from psychiatric patients to pensioners. When similar experiments came to light in America, the government ordered a massive public investigation. But the authorities here insist no inquiry is necessary.
In Britain, just as here, there needs to be an investigation about what went on during this period to see if patients were victimized for some other purpose.
If nobody raised the voice against the illegal experiments, how do we know that it cannot take place today? People have to get up and raise their voice.
I think it should be exposed. I think if it can prevent it happening again, I mean, if people are aware that these kind of things can happen, I think we ought to know.
Get to the truth fast before they bury everything. Before the government hides everything and you can't find nothing out. Because that's what the government does, putting it in boxes and crates and hiding everything from the public. And you'll never find out until another 30 years from now. Sometimes you'll never find out.